Well, interesting because for the last few years, he's helped us look at the world with a mix of the sense of history as well as economics. But he's also a celebrity now. A recent piece put out what they call the cult of Adam Tooze. And I think he needs no introduction in India, especially if you follow his absolutely grand newsletter. He's prolific, and it is the best newsletter out there to explain world events. Professor Tooze, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I must start by asking you a very short, simple, straightforward question about how you're viewing what's going on. And economically, we seem to be confronting very serious challenges.
I think that's right. I think we're in an incredibly precarious position right now. I don't know that anything has scared me as much as the moment of atomic nuclear saber rattling that we had in February in direct response to the Western sanctions imposed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't see a good outcome to that crisis. Obviously, many of us are hoping for a Ukrainian victory, but how we square that with the possibility of making a peace with Russia, which we will at some point have to do, I do not know. And in the meantime, the world economy is hugely on edge. We have a combination of interest rate increases, price increases for both food and key energy inputs. We know the pressure this is going to exert on the most vulnerable, both the most vulnerable in rich societies and countries and economies which are fragile, heavily indebted, especially those which are heavily indebted in dollars. So this is a real test in multiple different senses, I think, of the ability of elites all over the world to govern. To speak of a world order at this point already seems exaggerated. We have a variety of different challenges for Beijing, for Delhi, for the Europeans, for the United States, Japan. I mean, it's really the polycentrism which I think characterizes our current world has been made very, very manifest at this moment.
Okay, you've preempted my next question, which was that for almost a decade after the global financial crisis, we saw an almost leaderless world. And it seemed that way for a better part of the COVID crisis as well. And I'm wondering if you see that sustaining or persisting rather over the next several years and what the implications of that are.
I think we see nodes of leadership. I agree that there isn't a single leader.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's a relief. I mean, the world is too complex, for heaven's sake. I mean, we do live in a world which is polycentric, and that is right and proper. And the emergence of the major Asian powers, the proliferation of economic growth, the creation of the G20, it should really be a G30. At that point, it becomes too big. These are realistic adaptations to a world which is vastly more complex, also richer, more dynamic, more technologically empowered. So at that level, we shouldn't bewail this greater complexity and the fact that there is not a single moment of leadership. But I think what we do have to ask is on what we do have to ask is on the critical issues. Where does guidance, where does the possibility of crucial interventions come at the key moments? That could be in security policy, where in fact NATO has rallied very considerable resources to support Ukraine. It's not a global project, however. It's not a project of stabilization. It's a project of throwing those resources onto the side of Ukraine and then challenging other powers like India to line up with the West. So you could think of that as ordering, but it's a kind of violent ordering. It's a pushback against Russia's efforts to disrupt the order. In another sense, we say, for instance, the Federal Reserve acting in 2020 as a huge stabilizing force for the dollar world, but now, of course, exerting a huge drag on that same world as it raises interest rates. So we have a world with a series of power fields, of power structures, moments of leadership in each one of those areas and those domains. But as you say, not a single overarching hegemon.
Is this, well, those of us, anyone living in a particular age believes that it's happening to them for the first time. But this kind of world, have we lived through it before, and what have the outcomes been? Because at least for the last 20, 25 years, I think we've lived in a world that was led predominantly by the United States.
In certain key respects, it clearly was. I mean, America has an absolute dominance in military power, which remains, despite the talk of the hawks in Washington, insuperable, insurmountable.
Democratic values.
Yes, all of this
in various different ways.
Exactly, and then a huge preponderance of the dollar. So all of this is undoubtedly the case. And tech, this is the other.
Yes.
Is the great story of the last 25 years. These are vectors of American power. But within that world, we also have radically new phenomena, the emergence of India as a major player, for the first time really on the global stage as a major economic powerhouse since independence. This is not to say that, say, during the non-aligned period, India didn't play a very prominent role in world affairs, but in a particular way, precisely as a non-aligned power, sitting between the two Cold War blocs. India's position today is radically unlike anything we've seen before. And the same can be said of China, the whole roller coaster of the Chinese story, both its incredible rise and now the very fundamental problems that it faces and their implications for the world. To my mind, this does mark the current epoch as something different, as something radically new. And why should a world of 7.9 billion people not embrace that reality? Why should we constantly search to map this hugely more complex and diverse world back into the grids, say, for instance, of pre-1914 European power politics, and then China is like Imperial Germany? This seems trivializing and reductive of this incredible globalized reality that has really taken hold in the last few decades.
I get, and I'm not trying to push back the world into the grid that we've all been familiar with, but for the last few decades, I'm just trying to understand what this new world will be. And if it is likely to persist, as you pointed out, what does that mean for trade, for economies? So, okay, before I proceed on that, I want to break up the next few of my questions into two. First, I do want to know where you think or how you think this war on Ukraine is going to end and what the consequences are going to be politically and economically, because we've seen a variety of, different weaponry being used this time. And then I'd like to talk about a world in which China and the US are both equally dominant. First, how do you think this war against the Ukraine is likely to end?
Well, I think the Western powers, principally the United States, though it comes in the form, if you like, of an alliance with through NATO, have made clear that they will not tolerate and accept an outcome in which Ukraine is defeated by Russia. This is the first thing to anchor, because beyond that, I think everything else is radically uncertain. There are two possible scenarios here, I think, that could be mapped out, one of which is one in which the Ukrainian military continue to humiliate the Russian military. And at some point, the Russian military are really exhausted to the point where they have to retreat back to perhaps beyond the starting line from which they began, which would be back to the 2013 boundaries of Ukraine. This would be an extraordinary victory for Kyiv, and it would pose the questions of whether Moscow can live with that. And then we open up the possibility of scenarios of escalation, because it's very difficult to understand how Putin and his regime could tolerate the extraordinary loss of face that follows from that. I know there are people who say, well, they manipulate the entire media environment. They can just purvey whatever happens as a victory. That doesn't seem to me compelling as an account of how any totalitarian dictatorship I've studied ever worked. That wasn't how propaganda worked in the Nazi regime. You couldn't simply negate a defeat and turn it into a victory. That seems unrealistic to me. And if that's not the case, we have to worry about asymmetric escalation. In other words, a move into the realm of non-conventional warfare, chemicals, biological, or nuclear escalation, and that's a terrifying scenario. The other scenario is one in which Ukraine runs out of steam, and in the end, Russia is able to stabilize its position and perhaps defend the boundaries that it established in 2014, 2015. And that then becomes a scenario of an attritional struggle. If you listen to some American strategists, they're more hawkish and more cynical. They speak of this as an Afghanistan. And then the question, of course, is can the wider region and can the world economy live with the potential disruption of a prolonged slogging match in Ukraine? And this is a recipe for a humanitarian catastrophe, the collapse of Ukraine's economy, and permanent disruption to both energy and food markets, which will then ripple out through to the wider world. So to my mind, though the commitment of the West to ensuring Ukraine's non-defeat is cast iron at this point, and there's no way back for them either on that score, whether anyone really has a constructive vision of how we get to restabilization is an open question. And what I fear is certainly in Washington that the momentum is squarely behind a strategy which basically is driving towards the defeat of Putin. And that is a strategy of very high risk, and we should be clear about that. You can understand the attraction and the appeal of that strategy, but you have to ask whether or not they have gamed out the variety of risks that arise from it.
Do you think that's the strategy that will possibly prevail? Or in your mind and in your assessment, it's likely that eventually NATO and this alliance of Western powers and many other parts of the world will run out of steam.
Well, in this domain, America is driving the show, to go back to our earlier point.
Okay.
You know, when you look at who is providing support to Ukraine,
Yeah.
the Baltic states are making a vast effort, proportionally speaking. I mean, Latvia, Estonia are making efforts which are 0.7, 0.8% of GDP. Like that's their entire aid budget, which is going to Ukraine. But America has just voted $40 billion, and $40 billion is game changing. $40 billion is, 25% of Ukraine's pre-war GDP. So America is essentially bankrolling a total war effort for Ukraine, and the G7 leadership have agreed this backstop to the tune of 15 billion euros plus, which will ensure the Ukrainian government can continue to function. So this is a total war effort on Ukraine's part that is being supported by and funded by the West. So that is a dramatic commitment. It seems to me to create an irreversible commitment. Having made that commitment, you cannot fail. And the driver of that is American politics. And the significant thing about it is it's completely consensual in Congress, barring one or two Trumpite Congress people. It is massively consensual. And you can tell from that it's driven by very powerful domestic political pressures in the United States. No one wants to be on the wrong side of this issue going into the midterm elections. So again, one has to ask oneself, how far is this really a grand strategy? Or how far is this essentially a kind of convenient foreign policy for an American political system that is riven to the core and teetering on the edge of, there's all this alarmist talk about civil war, which I think is alarmist, but nevertheless, it captures the reality of very powerful division.
I was hoping you'd answer that question. Is it, about a riven society and two very fractured sides looking for one issue they can possibly agree on?
Yes.
Or do you think that America is going to push this all the way to the end? And your big concern is what then will be the reaction of Putin if he loses face and loses this war?
Well, I think there were two issues where you could see this rallying happening, and they were both foreign policy, and one was China and one was Russia. And the difference is that China is an unmanageably huge problem with world historic implications.
Yeah.
And the Russian problem with the Ukrainians doing the work of actually attriting Russian military looks like a soluble problem from America's point of view. They didn't anticipate this. In fairness to the Biden administration, this was not plan A. The Biden administration's plan A was to open the door to a reset with Russia. In the 2021, they were engaged in really very friendly diplomacy by the current standards, making concessions on arms control and things like that. They were not backing Ukraine. Zelensky's government was not exactly persona non grata, but certainly not in good standing in the West. It was treated with suspicion and to a degree of contempt, to be honest. The incredible about face that we've seen since then. And then all of a sudden, Putin handed them this possibility, which is that you could essentially eliminate one major piece of the geopolitical jigsaw puzzle that faces the United States. Well, you could take one big piece off the board. And I think that's what they're doubling down on at this point. Longer term, the view is all towards China, but China is a vastly greater challenge than finding the weapons necessary for the Ukrainians to destroy most of the Russian armory.
And I do want to talk about China and a little bit about India, because these are the two countries that have taken no side in this battle, though some might argue that China is maybe a little bit closer to the Russian side than the American side at this point. So this world where you've painted a scenario of where the US-led Western forces do their best to beat Russia out of Ukraine, what world does it leave us with? Because India is somewhere stuck in the middle.
Yes.
China doesn't seem to be on any one side, but closer to Russia. What is that outcome going to mean for us?
Yes, and you use the full spectrum of weapons to do it too, right? So you use the military forces, but you then also use economic sanctions and specifically drastic financial sanctions, really the closing off of Russia's $500 billion in foreign exchange reserves, a completely unprecedented step. It's one the Russians, it turns out, can ride out because we continue to buy their oil and gas. If we weren't doing that, it would be a different picture. So we have not severed all connections, but certainly any other major player in the global system has to ask itself, where do we stand in relation to this power complex, which if it chooses to, will really summon the resources like this. And it's been very interesting to see how India has simply refused to line up because it knows it has bargaining power at this moment. I mean, there was that entire ant trail of Western diplomats into Delhi. You've never seen anything like it. Everyone wanted to talk. all of a sudden, right? And the smart thing to do in that situation is not commit. Why commit? Like, you're empowered by this position. And I mean, I think it would be fair to say that the vast majority of states in the world actually have an interest in upholding certain basic elements of the rule of law, international law. And I think it's quite clear, for instance, that China had no interest in Russia engaging in this foolhardy, outright military assault on Ukraine at this point, or possibly ever, right? Russia had plenty of ways of exerting pressure on Ukraine that worked perfectly well to its advantage and wouldn't have driven Ukraine into the arms of the West in the way that they have managed to do, or for that matter, Finland, Sweden, the whole works. It's extraordinary. But that's rather different, this basic understanding that major powers have an interest in upholding the status quo because they are the major powers within that status quo. It's very different from being willing to underwrite a Western-led order of liberalism, which both India and China have every reason to be jaundiced about. I mean, and India has made its position, say, on global trade very clear in this score, right? It is not available for WTO-style deals. It's not even available for RCEP-style deals, right? It is a tough player with very complex domestic politics in which there's very little to be gained by positioning yourself as a liberal advocate of free trade. And everyone in the world of global trade deals reckons with that fact about India at this point. So I think that's a meta model for thinking about where we're going to end up, with a pattern of recognized differences where the whole does not aggregate, where you could maybe get a collection of very powerful interests to assert their interest in the status quo, but where if Russia chooses to shift it, you are not going to get what the West craves, which is somehow some sort of global affirmation of our vision of what that order is, because after all, you were right. You know, that kind of, you know what, that stuff you sold in the 90s, it was gold, you know, and Putin has showed us it. Like that argument is dead. And the sooner the West realizes that that logic is over, the better, right? I mean, and I think that I really feel that Western diplomacy is misunderstanding its position in the world in this moment if it makes those kind of appeals. The appeals should simply be, is Russia or Ukraine in the right here? And the answer on that level is it's obvious to everyone.
Correct.
Ukraine did not invade Russia.
Yeah. This scenario that you've painted, how does it change, or what is the impact when in a few years from now, not so long away, China becomes maybe the dominant economy in the world? Maybe not the dominant political force because of the autocracy issue, but the dominant economy. How does that change the balance of power? Does that make things more complex, or does that make things more equal? Because I know India is looking at these scenarios and wondering, where would we stand in a world like that?
Well, I think India's perspective on this is fascinating, right? Because India is a rival of China. You have a protracted and contested border with China. China's historic ally is Pakistan, India's great regional rival. So India's position in this configuration of China's rise is hugely complicated, and it does face, I think, difficult choices as to whether or not it then allies itself with the Quad, for instance, some sort of American Indo-Pacific construct, chooses to go its own way. I mean, for a while, I think India perhaps imagined that Russia would be a partner, at least when it came to military hardware, where there is a deeply long, exactly. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Cold War period. So, and so I think those questions are very real. I think this question of the timing is interesting, though, because if we'd had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago, that was definitely our understanding. In other words, there was a clock running on the moment when China's GDP was going to exceed that of the United States.
Yes.
And that was, as it were, the time horizon that we were thinking towards. I think it has to be said that given the economic shocks that China has suffered in the last couple of years and the serious impasse it faces right now on the real estate market, huge accumulations of debt in the private sector, in China's private sector, the problem and the impasse over the no COVID policy, predictions of China's imminent overtaking of the United States seem less relevant than simply weighing and coming to terms with China's existing weight in the world. You see what I mean? Rather than, as it were, deferring this conversation to the point when and having everything overshadowed by this totally symbolic moment when China's GDP exceeds that of the United States, the fact of the matter is that China's existing level of development, its existing presence in tech, its dominance in raw material and energy markets already make it a key force in the world. We're already at a point of multipolarity. And I think we've already seen the answer, which is that America can't live with it. America is patently unable and unwilling to accept that reconfiguration of the global structure. And the way you see that is not so much in trade diplomacy, but in the tech wars. I mean, in 2020, the United States declared economic war on China in the form of the outright surgical strike on Huawei. And Huawei is not just a cell phone manufacturer. It was the fourth largest private investor in R&D in the whole world.
Right.
And America's entire state machine was mobilized to surgically eliminate that company. America has basically announced that it sees a limit, an absolute limit, prospectively, starting now already, on China's technological development. And it does not want China to progress rapidly into very high levels of sophistication in AI. It does not want China to be a global player in communications.
But things don't always go the way America wants it to.
They absolutely don't. But the question, of course, is what price will China pay for overcoming that hostility and that resistance?
And you don't think China will pay a price or will be willing to pay a large one to overcome it?
Oh, no, it will. It already is.
Correct.
The question is how high will the price pay? I think the Chinese determination to break this obstacle must be absolute. I mean, if there's one thing that the Chinese regime is committed to, it's sovereignty. Whatever one may think about its broader ideology, it is a sovereigntist project. It is overcoming the centuries of humiliation. That's the entire project. So to be told by the United States this far and no further in tech, it's like if America wanted to choose a way, this is why I call it a declaration of war, because it really is basically constraining. It's not about seizing territory in the Donbass or one of these rather primitive territorial projects. It is saying that China will not progress at the cutting edge of industrial and technological development, and so will therefore not be a leading player in humanity's great adventure. And that cannot be acceptable to Beijing.
So we'll have America reclaiming its rightful place in the world.
Well, pretending to.
I say that tongue firmly in cheek. We'll have maybe a defeated Russia.
Yes.
We'll have
already defeated. Russia's already defeated.
Russia. Well, yes.
It hasn't accepted its defeat, but to all intents and purposes, it suffered a crushing defeat.
And taking its place, maybe, if I was to try and fit things back in the grid that we're all familiar with, will be China taking Russia's place, that is, in a bipolar world. Is that how you see it play out?
But yes, but no, in the sense that no, because China, with all due respect to the Soviet Union, China is 1/6 of humanity. China and India are in a special category of world historic development. The Soviet Union was the Tsarist empire, a multi-ethnic, multinational empire of European proportions, but a land version, analogous, say, to the Ottoman Empire at its fullest extent, supercharged by Soviet and Stalinist economic development. And that was a mighty thing, capable of competing with the United States in the high tech and in military hardware, but still essentially that, a relatively small group of people in a very large amount of land that is the legacy of Tsarist imperialism in the 19th century, the most rapidly expanding empire, right? So in a sense, they are the continuation, as Churchill understood it, of the great game between the British Empire and the Tsarist empire. China, like India, when unleashed as a nation-state force, is of a quality and of a type, sui generis, not comparable with each other either, really, as a result of their very different histories and different trajectories, and not comparable to any previous European or Western-derived experience of state power, because they operate on not just continental scale geographically, but on 1/6 of the humanity at a time, right? And this is the continuous correction that we have to make, especially as people of the West, but also anyone, as it were, entrenched in Western modes of thinking about power, about the scale of the operations in both cases, right? Whether it's Indian democracy and its various modern modifications, or the development of, the tech stack and India's experiments with various new forms of welfare on the one hand, or just the awesome mobilization capacity of the Mao-derived apparatus in China. These are something new under the sun that we have to come to terms with. And so, yes, China will be an antagonist to the United States. It already is, but no, it will not be the antagonist that the Soviet Union is. It's much more fundamental, to my mind. It's much deeper. It doesn't make the ideological claims, on the other hand, right? There's no now viable, outside, frankly, India, there is no very powerful Maoist movement that has any kind of purchase on any part of the world. So that is different from the Soviet model. But in terms of a a material challenge in terms of its significance for the rest of the world economy, it's incomparably larger and more transformative than the Soviet Union, even at its height.
When you say transformative, what do you mean? How is it going to transform the world?
Well, look at Australia, look at Indonesia, look at its entire environment. All of those places are being physically transformed by the demand for raw materials and energy from China. Look at the climate equation. In the 1980s and the early 1990s, we did climate politics quite legitimately, as though it were a problem created by the West and therefore also the responsibility of the West to address it, because climate justice demanded that.
Yeah.
The world that we've been inhabiting since the early 2000s as a result of China's stupendous, unprecedented growth is one where China is responsible for 29% of global emissions, and its per capita emissions are higher than those of most European countries at this point. So in that sense, it changes the parameters for all decision making in that vital sphere for humanity's survival. I mean, the West still, of course, has the onus is on the West to act and to lead, and especially in the super high consuming societies of North America. But the problem has no solution unless China acts. It literally is just simply there's no possibility. And we've also, to that extent, entirely forfeited our ability we don't control our destiny. It doesn't matter what we do. We have to make the right moves in the West. But even if we do, unless Xi's regime can, as it were, drive the largest decarbonization imaginable, that entire question is OTOs, right? There was
How
no
do
way.
you hold China accountable to this? And the reason I ask this question
we can't.
In this, yes, because one of the reasons would be it's not a democracy.
Well, it's also too big, right? In the same way as the climate.
But it's not a democracy. No pressure seems to work against the government. We saw that with these COVID shutdowns.
Well, this is going to be very interesting to see, because pressure does work against the Chinese government in the past, for instance, over pollution. And the main reason why they have moved to embrace the environmental agenda is that both India and China suffer these incredible coal power driven environmental disasters every year. Sure. In which tens of thousands of people die. I mean, there are major sources of death in both countries. In fact, it's far larger than that, right? It's hundreds of thousands of people die of respiratory diseases as a result of this pollution. And the regime is, in fact, highly sensitive to those pressures and has shown a willingness to move on them. But I completely agree that the no COVID situation right now is precisely for that reason also a huge challenge. Yeah. Because the regime is, and this goes to the same point, right, was hugely invested in its own success. Why? Because it does feel itself answerable to the Chinese population. An American-style essential herd immunity strategy, where 1 million Americans have died, that's the low-side estimate, would not have been acceptable to the Chinese regime. They don't have a way of just fobbing that off and walking away from it, right?
It's an interesting contrast, right?
It truly is.
Here's a democracy that allowed for this to happen, and here's an autocracy that you're saying can't afford to let that happen.
But it's not. I think it's better to think of China as a developmental dictatorship or a developmental authoritarianism. And this has always been a contrast with India, right? So India's nationalist political order after World War, after independence, did not successfully deliver on basic developmental promises to its population for decades.
Yes.
And was able to not deliver. And it wasn't essential to the project to deliver, right? This was always the critique of the subaltern studies of the Indian left. The failure to conduct a truly revolutionary transformation of Indian society meant that chronic abject poverty in basic metrics of health, education was totally persistent. Right? It's only begun to shift dramatically in recent decades. Yeah. Whereas the Chinese regime already by the 1980s had delivered basic healthcare and basic education to its entire population. The World Bank, when it went into China in the 80s, was staggered by what they saw, because they saw infant mortality levels which were comparable to middle-income European countries, life expectancies that were like those in bits of Italy in the 1980s, because the regime understood that the thing that sustains its legitimacy. And it's not just a cynical bargain. These people are transformational, nationalist communists who are driven by the project of modernizing their society in an incredibly powerful degree. They needed to deliver, and they did deliver. And to my mind, epidemic control is part and a parcel of that project. I mean, that this is something that is essential to the regime's mission, is a kind of output legitimacy that can be inserted into a national narrative of recovery, renaissance, and modernization. And you cannot have a disease breaking out from the traditional source of pandemic disease in the intersection between the rural, the wild wilderness of China, the countryside and the city, and then spreading from there to the rest of Chinese urban society, this would be a profound shot to the claim of the regime that it controls a modern and prosperous country. This problem now is, of course, it's largely as a result of our failure outside China to contain the disease. It's now facing a variant which it can't address with its first best strategy. No COVID, zero COVID is the first best strategy, and they implemented it successfully. I mean, it was the rest of the world, India, the United States, Europe, Latin America, which let this thing run out of control.
Okay, I'm not sure they implemented it successfully, given what we've read and heard about the strict controls they put
in the current
place.
version,
The
missing component, and it's a culpable
But-
failure
yes.
is vaccination.
But I didn't want to dwell so much on that as much as this world where. So what you've told me is that the two will be equal powers, the U.S. and China, but in different ways.
They will be
equal
will be,
weightage powers, but in different ways.
The world will have two major powers in it.
Okay.
More than two.
More than two.
And they will search for metrics, and the metrics will never quite align. And there'll be certain metrics on which, as it were, one can assert dominance, and other metrics on which the other can claim preponderance. And I no longer think we're in a world in which all of the metrics align in a kind of stack, where, as it were, economic dominance, financial dominance, soft power dominance, hard power dominance are all part of the same configuration of
that's
power.
done.
I
That
really
bit is
think
over
that's done.
and done with.
Yeah, I mean, you think of America's political legitimacy, where's that right now? Rock bottom.
That's true.
Even with Biden as president.
Yes. So what does that mean? Final question then. What does that mean for democracy? Nations are struggling with the ability to push democratic values. I'm not sure people are buying into it everywhere anymore. What does that mean for trade? So many people have said globalization is dead. What does that mean for the dollar? I'm curious. What does that mean for our economic future?
So I think for democracy, we have to stop thinking in these big, lumpy categories of democracy.
Sorry.
Which but it's a
slave of the past.
No,
right?
but it is and it was totally ideological even at the time that it was current and everyone accepted it, right? And we knew that America was a democracy and India was a democracy and Europe was a democracy, and they were all democracies together, and it was simple as that. India was the biggest and America was the oldest and most successful. Like, these stories don't work. What we need to ask ourselves is things like, what does democracy deliver in a democratic sense? In other words, does it reach the majority of its citizens? Say for something like healthcare. Does it enable participation? Can we speak of free speech? Are basic rights protected? So we need to ask questions which are not about democracy, yes, no, democracy, autocracy, but concrete, specific questions about delivery, about practice, about process, about values. Because a democracy which is simply one in which a populist nationalism or fundamentalism of another type runs riot and roughshod over the interests of minorities is maybe in some sense a democracy, but it's one we'd immediately want to qualify. A democracy in which you have a totally polluted media system is perhaps at some level still a democracy, but what kind of a democracy is it? What do we do when the judiciary becomes, as in the American case, radically politicized? Well, that's actually in some cases more democracy, but it may be intolerable to live under, and it may be hugely divisive and lead to an escalation of social tensions of a very radical kind. Maybe we want more liberalism, or maybe we want more defense of rights in a more fundamental and basic sense, or maybe we want more social democracy. All of those questions are going to be the interesting questions. Do we have political processes which are capable of thinking strategically about the climate, for instance, and warding off climate denialism, as remarkably the Asian states have, right? Because climate denialism would be really convenient for the Asian states, but they've not embraced it in the way that the Republican Party has in the United States. Yes. So this is where I think the conversation gets interesting. It's much more complex. It reduces aggregation to a big idea, but that's where we'll actually be able to say meaningful things about where the project of freedom, of rights, of free speech, of collective action in a free way, where that project is headed. And I don't think it's necessarily an optimistic story, but nor is it one that is one of blanket gloom.
So you're saying you raise everything about how you knew about the way the world worked in the past, because we're navigating uncharted territory.
I think it will. I mean, we cannot.
Effective.
Yeah. So what we need to do is enormously increase our armory of concepts, enormously increase the depth of our understanding. This is happening across the board. If you think about the way economic policy is flailing right now and unable to really grasp inflation, because we need to know about supply chains, like individual nitty-gritty individual processes which will determine whether you do get a vaccine or you don't, or whether, what impact would result from Germany switching off our gas supply from Russia. This is not something you can answer in the aggregate from the vantage point of a central bank. You need to understand some very specific things. Likewise with the energy transition. Carbon comes from 5 basic sources, right? Food, transport, industry. We need each one of those to understand how they work, and we can only really evaluate the success of policy against that kind of concrete detail. So it's a demand not to give up thinking and not to give up concepts, but to recognize how broken so many of them are faced with just the scale and the radicalism of the change that's undeniably going on all around us.
I understand carbon is the subject of your next book.
Well, it's one way of thinking about it, because it's one way of right? Given the huge dissensus we have over values, given the huge conflicts we have in so many other realms, to my mind, climate is a huge challenge. It's terrifying, and if we don't manage to deal with it, it has disastrous implications. But there is also, in some sense, something promising about it, in that Chinese scientists, Indian scientists, European American scientists and technicians, and a broad swath of public opinion and politics in all of those places can actually agree on what CO2 is and what the likely solutions are. And we can see some elements of those, and they will be in common. We need to move away from internal combustion engines to EV. It's going to be a hotter world like you're experiencing in India and Pakistan right now. It's brutally hot. You are going to need air conditioning. You will not be able to live without it. So how are we going to make that possible? These are questions which collectively we can work on and think through the politics of. We have to embrace the democratic politics of cooling. We cannot allow the poor, disadvantaged groups in society to be exposed to these kind of risks. It will literally be lethal. People will die in their hundreds of thousands and then in their millions if we do not solve these kind of issues. So that, to me, is where climate is energizing, because it gives us an agenda. It's not a total agenda, but it gives us an agenda that incredibly wide groups of people, society across huge parts of the world could actually agree on and recognize the similarity of problems.
Final question on India. You see it from the outside. Where do you think India is going to end up in this new, reordered world?
Well, I mean, it is one of the simple stories that we have to let go of, right? That India's democracy is alike pluralistic. Western democracies, that narrative is dead. It is dead. And it's dead by force of facts, right?
Yes.
There was always a way in which the multicultural, plurally religious, secular vision of Indian nationalism was a bet against the odds. It was defying gravity to a certain extent. And that doesn't mean that you fail, because we defy gravity in all sorts of ways, but it requires skillful willingness to suspend disbelief about certain fundamental, obvious facts about a society, and a willingness to push against that. And if you have major political players and entrepreneurs who actually want instead to reinforce those distinctions and insist on the force of those facts as the founding, organizing idea of their politics, then that project will fail. It will come crashing down. And then you have to renegotiate, and you have to figure out where, as it were, how you make a livable, stable society in the wake of that. And that, I think, is India's challenge at the current moment. And no one who cares about India or has any interest in it can be concerned, because at the very least, it's a new situation. At the very least, it's novel. We don't know how this works, and there's very good reason for thinking it harbors extraordinarily serious risks.
It does. But India is not as economically powerful as China.
No.
Definitely not first world as America. So where does it fit in? And if there were to be a hierarchy, where does it fit in? It's unique with its historical alliance with Russia. Where does it fit in?
Well, I think it challenges us to broaden our concepts in economic terms of developed and underdeveloped. You say it's not first world. I agree. It's not third world in any conventional sense. So those categories aren't helpful anymore.
Yes.
It's a developing society, yes, but very substantial parts of it are developed by any reasonable standard of the word, right? So and that is common to large parts of Latin America in the current moment, and indeed even some countries, the more successful countries in Africa, exhibit rather similar patterns. And I think ought to be thought of as productive, right? I mean, China, for instance, turned its success story of modernization into something it exported through One Belt, One Road.
Yes.
It seems to me that India does have a role to play in thinking about how you do projects, for instance, of public sanitation, how you do projects of rolling out basic electricity supply to genuinely poor societies and reaching not a few million people here or there, but hundreds of millions of people with electricity supply. These sorts of issues are places where I think India can really pioneer. The energy transition is potentially a very, very promising field for India with its considerable science base. There's really no reason why India, for instance, couldn't be a pioneer of low-cost photovoltaics or wind, in the same way as the Serum Institute has become, I think, an absolutely leading example of what lower middle income country expertise and manufacturing capacity could be. We need 7 other Serum Institutes around the world. And if one thing that India could do is a kind of not one belt, one road, but a Indian vision for export of how you do that, how in a society which struggles with basic water sanitation, you nevertheless build a Serum Institute that can do world-class vaccine production. If you can, as it were, package that, that is something you could, we need one in West Africa and one in East Africa, and we need at least one in Latin America as well. And that's just a start, right? And we need one in Indonesia, and we need to keep replicating that package. And so India has huge expertise and huge potential, I think, in pioneering a form of development and a vision of economic growth that refuses. I mean, is India ever going to overtake the United States GDP per capita? That is not a sensible question to be asking. The question is, can you escape? Can hundreds of millions of people really escape absolute poverty? And we're getting close to the situation where that's absolutely within reach on any basic measure in India. And that's to be welcomed. That's something that needs to be thought through and made available also for others to learn from.
I think the question is, can journalists change the framework within which they ask questions and expect answers?
Yes.
Not just of economists and historians, but politicians as well.
Yes.
Because I don't think any of the old answers apply, which is something you've said repeatedly through your work and in this interview and others. But I think it's becoming clearer because it's becoming so difficult to define who India is, where it lies in this complex system, right? So,
No.
yes, I think that probably is the best way to summarize everything that you've said, that everything we knew does not exist in the same way anymore.
And yet we know where we came from. So we know what we're after. In the Indian case, for instance, you know what you're after. And that may be agonizing in some way. It may be very difficult for folks that were invested in the secular national narrative to face, because it's a loss and it's probably irrevocable. But that at least does give us some determining sense of where we are, right?
It helps us recognize what we've lost.
I'm
not sure it does much more than that. But I don't mean it just for India.
No.
I think across the world, democracy, I think a multipolar world, but that one that speaks a similar cause, that seems to be something that's lost right now. Professor Tooze, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure,
I could do like 25 more questions, but I know you have a busy Davos. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
And thank you for speaking to us here.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.